Hi, welcome again. Today's lesson is on tips to memorize anions. So it's part 2 of our tips on memorization. Once again, take out problem book page 407, and today we're going to talk about how to memorize the anions. So these are on the right side of the chart and they are the negatively charged ions. So take this out and be ready to make some notes on it. As you're looking over problem book page 407 on the right side, you may notice that several things are familiar. You've seen the F symbol before, you've seen Cl, Br, I. You've seen several of these before. There may be some new things that you haven't seen, and let's talk about both what you have seen and what's new. So let's start with the things you already know. One thing you already know are many of the charges. The halogens have a -1 charge. The chalcogens, which if you remember last unit is the oxygen family, has a -2 charge, and the nitrogen family has a -3 charge. So here are the halogens. So these will all become, at least these here, will become -1, these become -2, these become -3. You may have already noticed that the names are not exactly the same as they were for the elements. So chlorine on the chart isn't listed as chlorine anymore, it's listed as chloride, which you've probably heard of. Fluorine is not fluorine, it's fluoride. Oxygen is oxide. Phosphorus is phosphide. So unlike the cations, sodium is still sodium when it becomes an ion. Calcium is still calcium when it becomes an ion. But anions, when an element becomes an anion, it changes the ending. So now I add this IDE ending instead of the ending it had before. So let's take a look at that chart again. So here we going down the chart. This should look familiar. Cl, when it's charged, it has a -1 charge, but now it's called chloride, bromide, fluoride, iodide. Those are all elements that are now ions. Let's go down here. Oxygen has become oxide when it's charged. Sulfur has become sulfide when it's charged. And let's go down here. Nitrogen has become nitride, and phosphorus has become phosphide. So the elements that we knew from the periodic table, when they become negative ions, which are called anions, they change the ending to IDE. So that's not too hard to do, just change the ending of those, and you already have those memorized. You may have noticed something else new, and that's something called a polyatomic ion. Poly meaning many, so more than one element together to make this ion. Polyatomic ions, ions with many atoms together, and they're going to stay together as a unit, which is going to be very important as we name compounds. So you might have seen this on the chart. NO3 minus is a polyatomic ion and its name is nitrate. But let's just take a look at this so you know what's going on. So the N is the nitrogen, the O is for oxygen, but there's a little subscript 3, and that means there are 3 oxygens. Notice it's a subscript, so it is not a charge. It tells me there are 3 atoms of oxygen bonded together with 1 atom of nitrogen. And together this unit with 1 nitrogen and 3 oxygen has a -1 charge. Notice there's no 1 there, but that's implied. And that's a superscript, so I know that's my charge. This is a subscript. I know that's not my charge. It tells me how many oxygen atoms I have. So when you look at that, 1 nitrogen, 3 oxygen, and together it has a -1 charge. So now we have to memorize all of those. But don't worry, there's a pattern. So if you know the pattern, it really cuts down on the memorization. So I'm going to tell you the pattern here, but then we'll also look at them. So you'll notice the endings, that there are a lot of them that end in ATE, 8. These ions are the ones that are the most common for that particular group, and those are the ones that we often have in class. There's another group that have an ending ITE. This means that they have one less oxygen than those with the ATE ending. Okay? You may also notice that some have a per prefix with an ATE ending, and that means those ions have one more oxygen than their counterpart 8, and ones with a hypo prefix and an ite ending have one less oxygen than the ite. And hypo and per may be prefixes that you're familiar with just from English class. So let's take a look at those. So you might want to look at the chart, and there's several with nitrogen and oxygen together. There is nitrate and nitrite. Nitrate has one more oxygen than nitrite, and both have a -1 charge. There's some ions that have phosphorus and oxygen together. Phosphate has one more oxygen than the phosphite. There are some with sulfur and oxygen together. Sulfate and sulfite. Sulfate has one more oxygen than the sulfite. So if I know the eights and memorize those, I will also know the ites because they just have one less oxygen. Now be careful, 8 doesn't tell you the number of oxygen. Nitrate has 3 oxygens. Phosphate has 4 oxygens. Sulfate has 4 oxygens. So be careful with that. It would be nice if it told us exactly how many oxygens, but it was based off what was the most common. So in class we have a lot of nitrate ions, but I don't have any nitrite ions because they're unstable in the presence of oxygen. I have phosphate, but I don't have phosphite, and I have sulfate, and I don't have sulfite back there. So the 8s were the most common one, but it doesn't tell us the number of oxygen. Ites simply have one less oxygen than the 8. So, wow, I hope you get that. The 8s are the common ones, and if you know them, then the ites are their counterparts with just one less oxygen. What about those per and hypo? Well, the only ones we have of all of those are the ones with chlorine and oxygen. So chlorate is ClO3 with a -1 charge. Chlorite would then be one less oxygen, ClO2 with a -1 charge. Perchlorate has one more oxygen than the 8, and the hypochlorite has one less oxygen than the ite. So if I know the 8 and I know the pattern, I know the ite, the per-ate, and the hypoite. Wow. So what about hints to memorize these? If you know the pattern, it saves you a lot of time. So if I know the ending of elements changed to IDE, then I already know fluoride, chloride, bromide, iodide, oxide, sulfide, nitride, phosphide. I already know those. I've memorized those. Polyatomic ones often have oxygen in them, and there's a pattern to that too. 8s happen to be the most common one. Ites have one less oxygen, per-ates have one more than the 8, and hypoite have one less than the ite. So if I memorize all the ones that end in 8, like nitrate and chlorate and sulfate and phosphate, if I memorize those and I know the pattern, then I've also memorized all the ites at the same time. So if I know nitrate, I know nitrite. If I know sulfate, I know sulfite. If I know phosphate, I know phosphite. If I know chlorate, I know chloride. So it cuts down on the memorization. Once again, make flashcards, write them multiple times, use Quizlet, just practice, practice, practice. Hope that helps you, and it won't take you as long to memorize these ions. Thanks for listening.